My guest today is Danielle Keperling, a passionate advocate for the preservation and restoration of historic properties. As the executive director of the Historic Preservation Trust of Lancaster County and an expert in the field of restoration through her own work with her business, Keperling Preservation Services, Danielle is deeply committed to keeping the past alive, not just as something to look at, but as something to live in, interact with, and cherish. In this conversation, we explore her personal journey into preservation, her thoughts on why historic spaces matter in our modern world, and how restoring these properties helps to preserve not just buildings, but legacies. One unique facet of this conversation is that we are diving into the unique preservation challenges and opportunities in Lancaster County, where the rich heritage of the plain communities like the Amish and Mennonite play a significant role. From their traditional craftsmanship to the balance of maintaining historical integrity while respecting cultural practices, Danielle sheds light on what makes preservation work in this region so distinctive and meaningful. Let's get started. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host and the founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma's silver.
I'm Danielle Keperling. I wear a lot of different hats. So with our business is Keperling Preservation Services. We restore 18th, 19th, and early 20th century buildings. And I have worked in that field in construction since 2001, first with my parents' company, and now since they retired with my husband. About 4 or 5 years ago, the Historic Preservation Trust of Lancaster County, which is the county-wide historic preservation organization, reached out to me to see if I would do some consulting with them. 3 years ago or so, they asked if I would be the executive director. So I'm the executive director there. I don't say part-time anymore, even though it is part-time. And then I also, as a volunteer, serve on the Historical Commission in Lancaster City, reviewing demolition, additions, and new builds within the Heritage Conservation District.
Okay. I have lots of questions along all of these lines, and I'm actually really excited. We were just talking before I started recording. This is my own neck of the woods in many ways too. So this is really interesting because like most areas really, Lancaster itself is seeing lots of growth.
Yes.
And I think this is where preservation plays such a critical role. But I do want to just go back for a little moment. How did you get into this line of work?
My father is a carpenter. So I feel like I grew up in it. If I would want to spend time with him on the weekends, I would go into the shop and he would put me to work cleaning the bathroom or doing some little thing. When I was in high school, I was going to be a social worker until March of my senior year. and then I was homesick one day and I saw a pastry school commercial and I'm like, I'm going to go make, these beautiful desserts. And so I went to culinary school right out of high school. And I did that for a few years. I got married and then was working for a small bakery. I loved it. I'm still friends with that family, but it was a small family bakery. I knew that there was no place that I could go there. And if I wanted to go further in the pastry world, I was going to have to switch jobs. And I was complaining about it one day. And my dad's like, I've been waiting for this moment. So he said, come work for us. So I pretty much started as a glorified secretary and I learned as much as I could. And then I did go back to school and got my bachelor's degree and then my master's degree. But it was a lot of on the job training and just being immersed in it.
Okay. And are you from the Lancaster area? Is this?
So I was born in Colorado.
Okay.
And we moved here when I was 10. So I've lived here most of my life.
Okay. So this is extra. I mean, this is truly, truly your home that you're a part of.
Oh, yes.
Preserving. And you've seen it in its various forms. And like I said, even in the last several years, it has grown exponentially and changed so much in good ways and bad, like any town, city, area. And we'll talk about all of that. But I originally was thinking, well, we can talk more about Lancaster in particular as the conversation goes on. But then I was realizing, I think in the conversation of preservation, your physical location probably also influences a lot of the very specific work that you're doing.
I think that that's true, like for the physical work. Like there were
Yeah.
things that were regionally done that maybe other regions it wasn't done, although there were similarities in the techniques or the materials. But one thing that's interesting, especially like during the colonial and into the 1800 period, Lancaster architecturally was about 10 to 15 years behind Philadelphia. And there's only an hour and a half difference now in the car, but
Yeah.
that 60-70 miles made that much of a difference just with the information being transmitted. Like if you look at a building here and down towards DC, it's even worse. I was standing in a building that I thought was probably like the mid to late 1800s, and it was early 1800s in Northern Virginia. So
Wow.
very similar building styles, but maybe the dates would be different because the information just wasn't easily transmitted.
And I also realized I just, again, because I am myself familiar with Lancaster, this is
Yeah.
only about 45 minutes to an hour from where I'm located. I'm perhaps getting a little ahead of myself in that I have an understanding of the community
Mhm.
that is in Lancaster. Are you comfortable providing just kind of a brief overview of
Sure.
the
Yeah.
area for
Yeah.
folks
So
listening?
Lancaster's the oldest inland city in the country, 1719, something like that. So the first city that wasn't a port city. We're about 60, 70 miles outside of Philadelphia. Now, tourist wise, we're known for our plain communities, the Amish, the Mennonite, the Brethren. And that's what the tourists come to see mostly, although I think some of that is shifting because we have a lot of other history to be shared with the country. Right now, Lancaster History is building the Thaddeus Stevens, Lydia Hamilton Smith Center for Democracy. It has a very long name, but it Center for Democracy, I think is the primary name. But that is, telling the part that Lancaster told, or Lancaster's story in the ending of slavery, and then also the ratifications of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So that's something that's very exciting and is a national story. But I would say Lancaster City is fairly diverse. As you go outside of the city, it's less diverse just because it's more rural, more plain communities. And I think that the county is right around 300,000 people. The city is around 50,000. We have a pretty diverse economy. So we have manufacturing, we have agriculture, and we also have a pretty big service-based economy. So we're pretty well insulated from huge fluctuations in the economy.
A lot of this conversation, not a lot of it, but it will certainly come up, is these plain communities because there is a lot of history there. There's also a
Yes.
lot of agriculture, which we'll talk about because surely that land plays into your job in bits
Right.
and pieces. So that's perfect. I realized I kind of bypassed saying that out loud because I've just had it in my mind. The
I
one
often do that. I don't understand why people don't understand what I'm saying.
I know. Couldn't we all just read minds by now? You would think. I was going to ask you a little bit about kind of again backing up a moment before I dive further into the specifics of your work, but could you tell us a little bit about your company and
So,
what
yeah.
you're working on?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, we restore 18th, 19th, and early 20th century buildings. We do have a mill shop where we can fabricate windows and doors and trim to and cabinetry to go into the houses that matches. But we also do the work on site. And so right now, my husband he's actually home today, not because of the snow, but because he's working overnight tonight at the Lancaster
Oh,
train station. They were doing like a modernization, not a huge preservation project, but two of the ticket windows need to be lowered to ADA height. So he's working overnight to cut the window down, bring the countertop lower. So that's all week this week he's working overnight. But those are the kinds of things that are interesting because it's making the building useful and more inclusive for everybody, but also, keeping what was originally there.
you kind of are naturally segueing into something that I've been curious about, which is because Lancaster has such a diverse,
Mhm.
rich heritage and history. What does your role kind of look like on the preservation side?
With my work with the trust, I have been trying to highlight some of the history that maybe hasn't been told. So a couple years ago at the train station, I guess it was only 2 years ago now, we did a display of like underrepresented stories stories. We had 5 different Green Book sites in Lancaster. Only one is still standing. The rest got torn down during urban renewal. So that's like something that's interesting to me, in the fact that I don't know if preservationists, even knowing that they were Green Book sites, would have gone to try to save these row houses, but they were an important part of Lancaster's history.
Yeah.
So those, and it was surprising to me the number of buildings that I was trying to find that were tied to these stories. Like there was a woman who in the early 1800s was running and printing the newspaper herself. Her husband had died. Her name was on the top of the newspaper, the predecessor to our local paper. And then she was the postmaster for 30 years, but until they took it from her because it wasn't a job for women.
Oh my gosh.
But I was searching and searching for where that building was, and it was torn down during the urban renewal too. So like those, like I thought that was a great way to tie our advocating for preservation to these stories that now don't have a place to be told.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
how interesting. And I was embarrassed to not really know very much about Green Book sites.
Mhm.
I love that you are educating people on that. I
Yeah.
had an opportunity this past year to speak with Candace Taylor.
Oh, she's great.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh, she was incredible. And that was just so eye-opening. But these are the kinds of things that I think a lot of people don't associate Lancaster with,
Yeah.
because it has such heavy Amish, Mennonite, even
Mhm.
Shaker origin, maybe. I
Mhm.
don't know if that's the right way to phrase that,
Yeah,
of
I almost
history.
think it was, I almost think it was marketing. Like they
Yeah.
decided in the 50s and 60s that this is what they were going to market.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting book that actually my husband's grandmother had me read, and it talks about, people came here for the plain communities, and they be tourists here, and they assumed it was like Williamsburg, that they were actors, and they wanted to have they want them to stop what they were doing and come and
Yeah.
interact with them. So it's very it's a very interesting situation. I'm sure it's very hard for them too, when they're out in the world, but it was almost fabricated. I mean, they've lived here for 300 years, and they weren't marketing themselves to be a tourist destination.
No, in fact, those who are around here know they very much value their privacy and want no
Right.
parts of that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's really interesting. How does, and I don't know that I'll word this properly, but what is the interplay for you, as far as, because you're preserving physical structures.
Yes. Yeah.
How does some of this history play into the work that you're doing, or do you have specific examples that you want to call out that might help connect some dots to understand some of the context of your line of work in this particular location?
A physical building and the history, or are you just like the stories that we're telling? What
Yeah, well, maybe both, because
Okay.
interpretation sometimes is a part of, or sometimes plays a stronger role in
Mhm.
maybe some of your projects than others.
Yeah.
But if you have specific things to call out, I think just to kind of connect dots along the lines of, again, Lancaster has a really specific heritage and a really
Mhm.
diverse history, but then also, you're working on, you said 18th, 19th,
In
20th?
early 20th.
And
Yeah.
early 20th. What is the heritage you're working to preserve? How does it vary project to project? A little taste maybe of what a day in your life is looking like compared to
Mhm.
perhaps someone in another city.
We say early 20th century. We go, from colonial period up until like right after World War II. And that's because, and this is kind of a backdoor way to explain, but I think we're going to get to where you're going.
Sure, sure.
That we say that because after World War II, building really changed. It became, instead of being, craftsmen that worked on the entire building like a whole house, they became product installers that had one thing that they did. They installed windows, they did drywall, they did one thing, and then each person came in. It became more like an assembly line. Some of that had to do with, during the Depression, there wasn't a lot of building that went on because there was just lack of resources. And then when we went into World War II, all of the resources went to the war effort. So afterwards, we needed to build a lot of houses fast, and that's what changed the building. So that's why we kind of have that as our cutoff now. That's us, as a company. Now there are, because the what makes a house historic age-wise keeps moving forward as we move forward. So the National Park Service, one of their criteria is 50 years or older. Well, that, puts us into the 70s. That is a challenge. I know that I mean, I have a soft spot in my heart for mid-century modern. That's a challenge because those building materials weren't meant to be repairable. And so that makes it harder to then restore and preserve them. Even though we are working across different periods, there's similarities with the materials and the techniques. Some things changed, like the doors, instead of being like full panels, they would get sticking around them, things like that changed as things went, but it wasn't huge changes that can't be compensated. So that's why that's kind of our cutoff. I would say personally, I feel like the buildings that have survived hundreds and hundreds of years are a testament to all of our heritage. I call it our collective built history. I feel like it's important for me in all the work that I do to try to encourage people to preserve them and also to make good choices so that they're here for another 100 years.
This might be a silly question, but I don't know what I don't know. Are you involved at all in the preservation of, because now a lot of the buildings, the architecture of these plain communities is actually something that, people are studying that.
Yeah.
Is that something you are involved at all in the preservation of?
Unfortunately, my experience with the plain community and preservation is not positive. And I have theories. I have not spoken to anyone in the plain community, so I'm not like a spokesperson. But my feeling is that they can't have like innovation in other areas of their life, so they want new houses. So oftentimes, especially with my work with the trust, I go out to do a demolition review because they want to tear down the old farmhouse that's on the farm and build a new house. Usually by then they've already stripped most of the historic fabric away of, like, so the windows have been changed, the doors have been changed, they've put vinyl siding on. Oftentimes, I've been in a few Amish houses. Oftentimes they'll cover the hardwood floors or whatever with linoleum because they don't have vacuums. So it's a lot easier to clean linoleum than it is to, do those things. So we've worked with Amish craftspeople and they do work in preservation, but in their own homes, I don't see a lot of preservation.
Are they, and I think this is something that I have asked folks in preservation before, a lot of old customs and traditions fall by the wayside because they're not taught or continued.
Right.
Do you have any inclination of whether or not that's something that these communities in Lancaster are passing down, or is it with older generations?
They do pass down. I mean, and I heard a statistic. So I mentioned my podcast. I had my last one for last year was Pennsylvania Dutch traditions for the holidays. And we talked about, he was saying that population doubles every 20 years. And so they are continuing to, pass on their traditions and their way, but it is shifting. I mean, even within the plain communities, the land is getting very expensive. There's not enough farmland for everybody to farm. So they're going into more cottage industries such as construction and building sheds and different things that they can ship out. Their way of life is shifting too, just because of the cost and the limited resources. And some of the younger people are moving away. I mean, they're still living in plain communities, but they're moving to, the Midwest or into upstate New York where the land is less expensive.
Speaking of the land, and again, I don't know what I don't know, but because perhaps less than it used to be, but I would say there's still quite a big focus for these communities on agriculture.
Yeah.
Does land and just the environment in general in that area have any interplay with the work that you're doing?
Not the land so much, but definitely I know that they have made changes environmentally because we are in the Chesapeake watershed. So that was there's been a big push to kind of change farming practices, and I think that we've actually collectively we have done a good job with that. The land preservation it's kind of like it's like adjacent to what we do, but it's not exactly what we do. But there is a lot of farmland that has been preserved in Lancaster County to help retain our agricultural, kind of that whole, not just the agriculture, but even just the way that the landscape looks and, what makes Lancaster special.
Yeah, I was going to, and I was just, of course, I can't personally think about Lancaster without thinking about the land
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
the agricultural communities there. So I was curious about the preservation.
There's two organizations within the county that actually just preserve farmland.
Okay.
So that, yeah, yeah.
Understanding again, the heritage is strong. You very briefly, you touched on interpretation. Do you have an example of a project where that was really important?
Yeah. Yeah, that is an interesting question. So when we work for private individuals, we're just helping to maintain or restore their house. So like
Right.
they're, we're just trying to make it livable so that, they have a house to live in. But when we work for like the National Park Service, interpretation becomes important. Several years ago, we helped restore the Carter Woodson National Historic Site in DC. So the house was built in the mid 1800s, but he lived there in the mid 20th century. It drove my dad crazy. They had like these really cheap locks for the windows that were probably from a hardware store. Like they were plated, they were really, and they're like, no, these are from our period of, my dad wanted to upgrade them. And they were
Oh
like,
my
this is
gosh.
from the period of significance. That's the Park Service term for like the period that they're interpreting. We have to stay within it. So we had to keep the cheap locks on it. And it drove my dad crazy. That becomes very important when it's like a public site, less so if it's, private ownership.
I'm thinking about modern day.
Mm-hmm.
Are there trends or things that are more common in preservation today that you are either finding really work or that perhaps kind of clash? Directions that you see preservation going? Is it specific to place? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts there?
I think our interpretations in general are becoming wider. Like we're not just telling the stories of the big houses and the men that, made the history there. We're telling the stories of, more everyday people. I think it's the Tenement House Museum. They're having in New York, they're having a display of like everyday dresses. And I really want to go see it because I just think that's kind of cool.
Cool.
Dresses that would have been worn that probably would have gotten thrown away, but somebody somewhere saved it in the back of a closet. And now they have like these dresses that everyday people wore. I think those kind of very tactile but also very everyday kind of things are special that they have, say they've been saved and they're here to kind of reflect back and tell us their stories. I've been lately on some like old house Facebook groups,
Mm.
and it's really hard for me to like let people give really bad information.
Yeah, there's a lot of
And
misinformation floating
there
around on that old
is. And
internet, isn't there?
I was just like, this, like, some of the ideas that people have are so, they're going to do permanent damage to their houses. And I'm like, I can't let, I have to chime in. So
No, I
that's
know.
one thing that like I think it's great. Like I'm in some support groups. Like I think it's great to be able to connect with people and
Yeah.
to like learn from each other's experience. But I also think you need to kind of be a little cautious on whose advice you're taking.
Yeah. Well, okay,
Yeah.
let's use this as a segue for a moment because I was going to talk about this later, but I think if we're going to talk about advice education, it would be appropriate for us to give you a platform for your hub.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, we did create the Keperling Preservation Hub, and it's an online resource center with tons of articles and downloadable books and videos, podcast transcripts. And then you also get to do virtual coffee breaks with us. That's twice a month online meetings. You get to come on and get your questions answered. And then you also get a one-on-one consult with me. So that's one, and this was before we created this before I was in the old house groups, but I think it's important for us to be able to share our knowledge because we're a small company, we can only impact so much. So this is a way for us to share the knowledge that we've accumulated over the past couple decades to be able to share it with people who love their old houses and want to make the best decisions for them.
Absolutely. And how would folks gain access into this?
If they go to our website, which is Practical Preservation Services, right at the top, there's a link to click.
Perfect. I'll make sure, and I'll mention this again later, but we'll put that in the show notes. I think that's brilliant. I did have some questions for you that were more pertaining to your private
Oh,
homes
sure.
that you're working on. So Are you working to, are these folks who are contacting you because they want to restore their property and they perhaps, because I know this area has a lot of historic register.
Mhm.
There's a lot of things that, again, you're on the historic commission. I sat on my local commission. I know there's a lot of projects that you are required to submit them through your township. Is it folks who are looking to maintain the historic integrity of their property who are bringing you on board, like historic restoration to period? What does that look
It
like?
depends. It depends.
Okay.
And kind of my philosophy is that for a building to be preserved, it needs to be useful. So I
Mm,
don't believe in like turning every house into a museum.
right.
We need to have some museums, but everything doesn't need to be a museum. I think that there are choices that you can make that will not necessarily make it museum quality, but will make it so that the historical integrity will stay, so that the house will continue to, survive. So the majority of the people that reach out to us, really love their old homes. They want to make sure that they're making good decisions and taking care of them. But we get called for small maintenance projects, but we also get called to make it more functional. A lot of
Mm.
people are trying to live in age in place. A lot of people are, wanting to put update bathrooms and put on a porch, like a historically appropriate porch. Those kinds of things are also the kinds of things that we do. In addition to, like, we have a client that is a very narrow house. Like, you have to walk through hallways to get through the house. Like, it's just very narrow. And it's one of the oldest houses in his area, but they have a young daughter. They wanted to have a more functional house for her. So they built an addition that has a big family room. So they didn't tear apart the historic house. They built an addition that would have a big great room that's connected to the kitchen. So you're kind of getting that modern living with the historic home. Private property owners definitely have a little bit more flexibility than the ones that are going to be museums. I think that making it more livable will help it survive. If somebody comes along and says, well, this, it's old and it doesn't work for how we live, then, they're going to be more inclined to at least try to demolish it.
I love that. And I just want to repeat it for a moment. Making it more livable will help it to survive.
Yeah.
Part of the reason I love it so much is because, and I've said this a million times on this podcast, but I'll say it again. I think preservation often gets a bad reputation. It isn't necessarily about being stuck in the past or bringing something into the past. It's about making sure the past can be brought into the present.
Yeah, I think that that's really an important point, because, kind of back to the Facebook groups, people are like, oh, if you reach out to these people, they're going to make you do something. I'm like, I wish I had power to stop you from making bad decisions, but I don't have that power. but people
Oh
do.
my
People
gosh.
make assumptions that, that there's so many rules with a historic building. And unless you're in like a conservation district like there is in Lancaster or something like that, there aren't really rules, unless the local municipality has an ordinance. So there's a lot of misconception about what even, owning a historic property means and what you can do with it.
I will say that I find, and I mean, we hear people talk about this all the time, right? Like older houses are often just made better,
Mm-hmm.
and they do tend to have longer lives than a lot of the more modern buildings. Some very obvious reasons, some that people might not think about. Are there things that perhaps you've learned from historic structures that you wish modern builders and designers would be taking into better consideration just from your own experience dealing with all of this?
I think choosing, and this is coming from a sustainable building standpoint, and also a green, kind of like green building. I think choosing materials that can be repaired
Mm,
is really important. If your traditional window fails, it can be repaired. If you break a pane of glass, you can just change that one pane. You don't have to replace the entire window. The traditional methods and materials were made to be repaired and rather than replaced. And the building materials that are being used now are just made to be replaced. When they in their lifespan, they're just made to be thrown away and new get put on. And I think that it will make building more expensive, but I think it's a shift that would help us, have the new buildings last longer, and also, keep. I think it's like 30% of our landfill waste is construction, and
is it
so
really? That's
yeah,
wild.
Yeah. And
Wow.
so those kinds of, if we can make those shifts, I think it could make a difference, not just for our building stock, but also for the environment.
Fingers crossed that we have a really big wish list for 2025. Let's tack that on. Obviously, you could better speak to Lancaster because it's your home, but I know as far as preservation goes, this applies anywhere. Heritage to a point, but like cultural identity. And I have to think of the best way to word this, but you were talking a little bit about interpretation. Do you find that, and maybe it's not so much in your private homes that you're working with, but and maybe it is. Again, who am I? I have no idea. But are you finding that in preservation, like you're thinking about any of that? Or because I know, I'll backtrack for a moment in just my brain space here. I often associate preservation with historical integrity
Mm,
and
yeah.
ensuring a sense of place and belonging.
Mhm.
And nothing drives me more up a wall than, driving through a town that just has like a random McDonald's in the middle of its historic district. Or, just all those, or a
Yeah.
building that is just, had they just given it a smidge more thought, could have
Yeah.
just fit better. Is that something that you are a part of, those conversations? And maybe it's more on the historic, commission side, because I know those
Yeah,
are
I was going to say
conversations.
that, like, at least like the infill buildings is through my work with the historical commission, where we'll review there right now. The developers are smart right now in Lancaster. They're picking all the parking lots and building on those.
Mm.
So there's not a fight over the building on it that they want to tear down. But we have several large for Lancaster apartment buildings going in downtown, in former parking lots. So we have to review those infills, and those get to be challenging, especially for me, because I feel like I'm out of my depth with like the new construction,
Mm.
like that whole design conversation. Like, I know what should go into a historic building. Do I know what should go in a new building? I don't know. So
Right.
I kind of feel a little bit out of my depth looking at like massing and like making it feel like it's not looming over everything. Like, those kinds of things are questions that I kind of struggle with a little bit, especially when we're going right up against a historic building, and then the developers coming in and saying, well, we need it to be this many stories because that's the only way that the math and the finances work. And I understand that from a business standpoint, but I also don't think we need to be 10 stories above the building beside it. We make changes, we make suggestions, we ask for some compromise. That review process, like, one thing that I really appreciate, and the architects that work in town a lot, they'll bring it in for a conceptual discussion where they bring their initial ideas, we give them feedback, and then they come back with, and usually what they come back with takes into account the feedback, and then it's a much better design. So I think if people approach it as more of a collaborative effort, it's a lot less
Combative.
contained. Yeah.
And it is great and especially that you're experiencing that
Mhm.
collaborative nature, because I think that is also where preservation gets a bad reputation, and historical commissions and local historical groups get a bad
Mhm.
reputation, is because you will often see these developers come in to these meetings with things that make absolutely no sense. And of
Right.
course, the resounding response is going to be no. And so
Right.
then they start to get disheartened and
Mhm.
irritated. But if you just go into it asking for feedback from the beginning, then you're not putting in all that work before
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
before
And
you're
I do,
shot
like, from a
down.
business standpoint, I do. I sit there and think they put a lot of money into this design, especially if they don't, come first. And if it's really bad, we can't just approve it, because then that sets
Right.
precedent. When you said, this is completely, well, it's not off topic, but it's just a Danielle brain thing. When you were talking about them getting a bad rap, there was a season of American Horror Story where they're going in front of the historic commission, and they're in New England, and they have two different whites. You can't, from the TV, you couldn't tell a difference. And they're like, we want to do this way. They're like, I can't believe you choose that. And that encapsulates what people imagine when they go before a historic review board.
It's too funny. And it is, it's interesting. I think too, the misconception, I might have said this before on this podcast, so sorry folks if you're listening and I'm being redundant, but I do remember just sitting there feeling like we're on the same team. A lot of developers and builders would come in feeling like they had to be on the defense
Mhm.
from the
Yeah.
get-go. Of course, I want easy, quick food. I would love a great restaurant so that I don't have to drive 15 minutes to go out to eat. People forget that we're on the same team. We're all looking out for the betterment of our communities. It's
Right.
just the approach and being able to meet in the middle.
Mhm.
And I do wish that more developers and builders would recognize that these commissions and preservationists are not meant to be roadblocks, but just
Mhm.
guideposts.
Especially with my work with the trust, we say to developers, we're not against development, but we also don't need to demolish every historic building in our way. There are a lot of ways that you can adaptively reuse a building or
I was
incorporate it into
just
your
about to,
design. Like you don't have, we're not saying you have to save everything, but you don't have to tear down every building either.
yeah, I was just about to ask. I'm so glad you said that because I was just thinking to myself, historic reuse.
Yeah.
Is that something that you're encouraging that people are
Oh
receptive
yes,
to?
definitely, and we encourage that within our business also. But I think that's an excellent solution, and it saves. You're starting with something, and it's a structure that is a lot stronger than what could be built now. And more sustainable. So I think that adaptive reuse is a great solution, and it's a great way to revitalize downtowns too, and
Yeah.
old industrial sites.
I was going to ask because again, you have kind of your foot in multiple worlds here, which is sort of private business and community.
Mhm.
Are you at all involved in not trying to change folks' perception of preservation, but are you at all involved in sort of like encouraging people to interact with preservation and getting them to see the importance of preservation in Lancaster?
That is one of the things that I try very hard to do, because I think that, as you said, preservation gets a bad rap, but also getting younger people involved in preservation and getting younger people involved just in being interested in the history. And there are some, like, I meet some delightful young people that are so into history, and I have great interns from the local colleges that are driven and really interested, want to learn more. But just the general public, I think that having more engagement, that's one of the conversations that we've had at the trust. And also there's some planning sessions for the America 250th anniversary next year, of
Yeah.
getting younger people involved in that planning so that we can make things that they would be interested in. And I'm excited to try to see what we can do with that, because I think it's very important for everybody to feel like they're a part of our history and our country.
I am kind of backtracking here, but community, this is a little more Lancaster County centric, but would apply to any really rural area.
Mm-hmm.
There's a city,
Mm-hmm.
there's very rural outskirts, there's suburbia. So I'm curious, like, what perhaps some of the different challenges are within each of those locations or neighborhoods, I guess
So
is the better way to
yeah,
word that.
from a preservation standpoint, I would say rural is the hardest. The only way that a building is protected, unless it has a easement on it, which is like a conservation easement. It's the same as like the farmland trust and the land conservation. Unless it has that, the only thing that protects it is the local ordinances. In Lancaster County, I think we have over 60 municipalities. Some of them have really good ordinances. Some of them have none, like no review at all. If you wanted to demolish your building, you could just go do it, and
Mm.
you don't even have to pull a permit. So that to me is very challenging. And then the developmental pressures in the suburbs are where, like, we're focused mostly for my work with the trust, of like, how can we, there's a big west push right now, and there's a lot of little small farms that are going to get gobbled up by these housing development tracts that are pushing towards the Susquehanna River. In the cities, well, in Lancaster City, Columbia Borough and Strasburg Borough, they have like historic review commissions. So then that's like the highest level of like review for changes. The rural areas, I think, are the hardest to encourage, and also to get the people to understand that preservation is important. And some of that, I think, is there's just such a, going back to the plain communities, like this is my property and you can't tell me what to do with it. So the
Yeah.
elected officials don't want to go against that either.
Are you at all involved in the advocacy?
At the trust, I am. We go and meet with the municipal officials. We have a preservation summit in the fall where we open it up to everybody. Like anybody who's interested can attend, but then we do invite the municipal officials and the historical societies, and just try to get everybody in the same room for a day
Yeah.
and give them, get people talking, and there have been connections made, and some of the communities are starting to try to make their ordinances at least have a review process, things that aren't too cumbersome, but then would give the municipality a little bit more power when a building is going to be demolished.
Speaking for yourself and your own hopes and dreams and wishes, what is your ideal scenario for the future of Lancaster City, the
Yeah.
rural areas, the
Yeah.
plain communities, their buildings and
I would hope that we could save as many buildings as we can. They're reusing them and making them useful, because I think that that's the key. I think that smart development is the way to go. We need more housing. Everywhere needs more housing. I mean, the housing affordability is a huge issue. We went west this past fall to see some of my family. Everywhere we went, people were talking about housing affordability, and it was much worse than it is here. Making the developments, rather than being, the traditional suburbia where you get a half an acre, for each house, making it much more dense is a smart way to use our land. Those things are smart. And then educating people about why, traditional building can be greener, more sustainable, and then bringing the green building people and the preservation people together, I think it would be a great combination also.
do you have any advice for folks who are interested in getting into preservation but really don't know where to start or are looking to, and this is maybe two separate questions, but I was just kind of thinking back to even what you were saying, like scrolling on these Facebook boards and
Oh
and
yeah.
and forums and folks posting. It's kind of a catch-22, right? Because it's like they're trying, but they don't know what they don't know.
Right,
So
exactly.
what kind of feedback would you have for someone who, these folks who are interested in
Mm-hmm.
asking the questions?
I would encourage anybody who's interested in preservation to reach out to like local preservationists. I have people often reach out to me and ask, either, students that are finishing up their degrees and they're wondering what kind of jobs they could get, people who want to get into the trades. And I know that the preservation community is typically pretty friendly. So if you reach out to them and you want to learn more, definitely you can. I would say for a homeowner that is like, I don't know what to do. Yeah, get on the forums, read, but like, be cautious. But I would also say the National Park Service has a great resource, preservation briefs. I think there's over 50 of them now, but they're specific, topic specific, little, I don't know, maybe 10-page long brochures about how to handle masonry restoration, making your home more energy efficient, plaster, like so it's very technical advice
Yeah.
that is a free download from the National Park Service website. And it at least gives you a starting point to know, when you're talking to contractors or talking to other people, what good information is. And then
Yeah.
you can kind of filter through.
My brain is kind of in 2025, new year, fresh
Yes.
resolutions, fresh goals. What are your personal aspirations for this year for your business or for what you hope
Yeah.
to accomplish as part of your historic community?
Mm-hmm. So for the year, for our business personally, I'm working on getting the hub launched. So that's exciting to me. And I'm also wanting to build more consulting work, because I feel like I can help more people that way, because it's not, the hands-on is slow. It's a slow process. So I can help more people if I can just share my knowledge. For the preservation community as a whole, I think I already mentioned it, but getting more young people involved in the America 250th anniversary. And we're starting at the trust, we're starting a new speaker series, and we're having speakers come in and speak about different topics. And I'm excited to really get interesting voices that maybe haven't been platformed before, and allowing them to have that opportunity.
The 250th is in 2026, for those who may not know. And there is going to be, particularly in this region, so much going on. And I really do hope that folks not only perhaps try to get involved in the planning of these things, but at least take advantage of participating once
Oh
they
yeah.
are launched. Just on the back end and having conversations with folks about their plans for 250th. There's a lot of energy going into this since probably even 2022. I mean, this has
Yeah.
been
It has been going on.
2022.
Yeah.
I would argue
Yeah.
that a lot of it really ramped up. So, I mean, people are putting a tremendous amount of effort and energy into programming, events, ensuring that their new exhibits and all sorts of things are coming to fruition so that we can go and enjoy them. So I just really hope folks take advantage of that when it does roll around.
Yeah.
How can people find you? Website, social media, all that kind of stuff.
So our website is practicalpreservationservices.com. The website is Keperling Preservation Services. Our Instagram is Keperling Preservation, and then our YouTube is Keperling Preservation Services. And if you're interested in the podcast, it's on all the social media platforms, but it's also on our website.
Well, I'll make sure to link to all of this too, but that way folks can easily find it if they're preferring to access the show notes that way. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down because this is just really interesting. I love talking preservation.
Thank you so much for having me on. I enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.